everything just cracked. In an unprecedented move not seen in 50 years, the U.S. economy has officially crossed into the danger zone by its own hand. Markets survived the shock, but the bill didn't disappear. It was only delayed. So here's the question no one wants to answer. How did a victory turn into the most dangerous economic gamble in modern American history? Stay with us, because what happens next rewrites the rules forever. The first warning did not come from a speech. It came from the sound of terminals updating, thousands of them almost at once. A low, continuous hum across trading floors, the kind that precedes panic. I have covered market collapses for decades, and I can tell you this without drama. This felt different, not because of the numbers, those would come later, but because of the source. On April 2nd, 2025, the White House announced what President Donald Trump branded Liberation Day tariffs. The language was triumphant, the framing was defiant, but within 48 hours, nearly $5 trillion in market capitalization evaporated. The S&P 500 fell 10%, marking its worst two-day drop since the COVID panic. No virus, no bank failure, no war declaration, just a policy announcement. That is the core accusation of this chapter. The shock was self-inflicted. Markets did not wait for tariffs to be collected. They did not wait for customs forms or supply chains to seize up. They reacted immediately because tariffs operated first as an expectation shock. Once announced, they reprice the future. Costs are modeled, margins are revised, earnings forecasts are torn up. Capital retreats before the first dollar is taxed. I have seen this pattern before, 2008 when trust in banks collapsed, 2020 when COVID froze the world. But those crises were triggered by forces outside immediate political control. This one was not. This was a human decision delivered at a podium with cameras rolling. Behind the screens, the logic was ruthless. Tariffs are taxes, not theoretical taxes, real ones, paid upfront by importers, passed downstream to businesses, and eventually absorbed by households. Markets understood that instantly. They understood that even partial enforcement would compress profits, raise prices, and slow investment. And they understood something else. Policy volatility itself is a cost. President Trump called the move liberation. Markets read it as a tax imposed by one hand on the other. I remember thinking, and it is difficult even for me to say this out loud, that the reaction felt less like fear of policy and more like fear of unpredictability. Investors can price bad news. What they cannot price is a system that may change direction by morning. The consequences reached ordinary Americans faster than any tariff schedule ever could. Retirement accounts shuttered. For millions nearing retirement, balances built over decades swung violently in hours. Consumer confidence stalled. Households delayed purchases not because prices had risen yet, but because they expected them to. Businesses froze capital spending. Expansion plans were shelved. Hiring paused. This is how economic damage begins. Not with empty shelves, but with hesitation, with silence in boardrooms, with families deciding to wait one more month. Trump dismissed the turmoil as noise, a temporary reaction, a small price for sovereignty. But markets are not sentimental and they are not ideological. They respond to incentives and risk. And in those 48 hours, they delivered a verdict that no slogan could soften. This was not liberation. It was the opening tremor of a much larger rupture. On paper, the numbers look calm, reassuring even. Inflation hovers around 3%. Unemployment sits near 4%. Gasoline prices dip below $3 a gallon. President Trump points to these figures and calls them a historic success, a vindication, proof that the turbulence of Liberation Day was a brief overreaction. But this is where experience forces an uncomfortable pause. I have watched economies collapse that looked far healthier than this, right up until they didn't. And what we are seeing now has the unmistakable profile of a sugar-high economy. Sugar works quickly. It floods the bloodstream with energy. It creates a sense of invincibility. But it is not nourishment. And when it is not balanced with protein, real investment, fiscal discipline, productivity growth, the crash is not a possibility. It is a certainty. The sugar in this case is easy to identify. tax cuts without offsets, broad deregulation, deficit-financed spending, and relentless pressure on the Federal Reserve to ease monetary conditions even as inflation remains above target. Each measure delivers immediate relief. Each one also postpones the bill. The missing protein is harder to admit. Long-term capital formation, infrastructure that raises productivity rather than headlines. A credible path to debt stabilization, labor policies that expand supply instead of constricting it. These are slower, politically inconvenient, and largely absent. Follow the data closely and the illusion begins to crack. Employment growth in 2017-2019 averaged roughly 180,000 jobs per month. In 2025, that figure fell to about 55,000. Headline unemployment stayed low, but the engine slowed. This is not expansion. It is tightness. Wage growth tells the same story. Real wages rose, yes, but largely because labor shortages were engineered, not because productivity surged. Mass deportations removed hundreds of thousands of workers from agriculture, construction, and food processing. When labor becomes scarce by force, wages rise briefly. So do prices. Economists call this a supply shock. I call it pulling a brick out of the foundation to make the living room look taller. Inflation appears contained for another reason rarely mentioned in speeches: inventory timing. Much of what Americans buy today was imported before tariffs fully hit. Warehouses are still clearing old stock. Prices have not yet absorbed the new reality. This is not control. It is delay. I have never seen a situation where postponed costs simply vanished, not once. For households, the effects arrive unevenly. Short-term income gains feel real. Refunds are larger. Paychecks look better. But living costs creep upward quietly. Insurance premiums, groceries, replacement parts, home repairs, nothing explodes at once. That is what makes it dangerous. Those at greatest risk are not speculators. They are retirees, people over 60 who depend on stability, interest income, predictable prices. They do not benefit from volatility. They are not positioned to wait it out. And it is difficult even for me to say this plainly. They are being asked to underwrite risk they did not choose. President Trump dismisses these concerns as trivial, overblown. He treats inflation as a solved problem and debt as an abstract concept. But sugar highs always feel like triumphs, right up until the moment the room goes quiet. And when that silence comes, it is never the architects who pay first. This is the moment where the story stops being abstract and becomes arithmetic. Cold, unforgiving, impossible to spin. The central accusation is not complicated. Tariffs are taxes paid by Americans. Not by China, not by Europe, not by Mexico, by households and businesses inside the United States. Full stop. History has never recorded an exception. Under the current policy regime, the average U.S. tariff rate has climbed to 17.7%, the highest level since 1934, the era of Smoot-Hawley, an act now taught as a textbook accelerator of economic collapse. When I first saw that number, I had to check it twice. I have covered financial crises for decades. I have never seen a major economy voluntarily walk back to pre-World War II trade barriers in peacetime. The administration treats this as a negotiating tactic. Markets treat it as a permanent shock. The Tax Foundation, a conservative-leaning and nonpartisan institution, estimates that these tariffs translate into a $1,200 annual tax increase per U.S. household, rising to $2,600 once the full regime is implemented. That is not theory, that is math. Prices rise because costs rise. There is no patriotic discount at the checkout line. Then comes the labor shock. Mass deportations removed hundreds of thousands of workers from sectors already operating on thin margins. Agriculture, construction, food processing. When labor disappears, supply contracts. When supply contracts, prices rise. Economists call this a cost-push inflation spiral. I will say it more plainly. We created shortages and then acted surprised when things got expensive. What makes this phase uniquely dangerous is the pressure applied to the Federal Reserve. President Trump has repeatedly attacked Chair Jerome Powell, publicly demanding rate cuts and openly floating the idea of replacing Fed leadership with someone more flexible. I have seen this movie before, just not in the United States. In emerging markets, the moment a central bank loses perceived independence, credibility collapses. Inflation expectations become unanchored. Capital flees. Currency weakens. This is not ideology. It is pattern recognition. And it is deeply unsettling to see the world's reserve currency flirt with the same dynamics. Then there is the legislative centerpiece, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, OBBBA. The name sounds theatrical. The consequences are not. The bill makes the 2017 tax cuts permanent. It exempts tips and overtime income up to defined thresholds. It shields most retirees from federal tax on Social Security benefits. Individually, each provision polls well. Collectively, they bleed the balance sheet. There is no serious offset. The much-advertised efficiency cuts, about $160 billion, are one-time savings. The tax cuts cost trillions. Independent models estimate the national debt will rise between $3 and $7 trillion over the next decade. And here is the quiet truth no one campaigns on. Debt at this scale forces choices. Social Security and Medicare do not vanish overnight. They are slowly rationed. Eligibility tightened, benefits trimmed, costs shifted. If not today, then tomorrow. If not for you, then for your children. Trump mocks these warnings as fear-mongering. He treats debt as a distant abstraction and inflation as a solved problem. I have never seen such confidence coexist with such risk. Bills deferred do not disappear. They compound. And eventually, they are delivered to people who never voted for them and cannot vote them away. At this stage, the strategy becomes visible in full. Not policy, pressure through instability. What we are witnessing is the economic adaptation of the madman theory, first tested by Richard Nixon during the Cold War. Convince adversaries and allies that you are unpredictable enough to do real damage even to yourself, so they comply rather than risk escalation. President Trump has applied this logic not to nuclear brinkmanship, but to trade, tariffs, and market shock. In the narrowest sense, it worked. Faced with the threat of punitive tariffs and sudden policy reversals, multinational corporations moved fast. Samsung committed $37 billion to semiconductor production in Texas. Hyundai pledged $26 billion across auto and steel facilities. Toyota announced a $21 billion expansion of U.S. manufacturing. These are real factories, real jobs, real capital flows. No one disputes that. But I have never seen a coercive strategy that did not reveal its own limits over time. And this one broke quickly. The first fracture came with reversals. Tariffs announced as permanent were paused within days. Liberation Day was followed by a 90-day suspension. Then tariffs returned. Then ceasefire talks. Then new threats. Markets do not fear toughness. They fear inconsistency. Each reversal signaled not strength, but a threshold of pain, a point at which the administration would blink. Negotiation theory is blunt on this. A widely cited Harvard negotiation project, Finding States. Once the opposing side knows you will eventually retreat under pressure, your leverage evaporates. At that moment, chaos stops being a weapon and becomes noise. Internationally, the consequences hardened fast. China retaliated with tariffs ranging from 84 to 125% on U.S. goods. American agricultural exports collapsed almost overnight. Soybean farmers, already operating on thin margins, lost a primary market they spent decades building. These are not abstract victims. They are counties, families, and communities. The Peterson Institute estimates that by 2026, U.S. GDP could be 5% lower than it would have been without these trade policies. That is more than $1.3 trillion in lost output. I paused when I read that number. I have covered crises for decades. Losses of that scale usually follow wars or financial collapses, not negotiating tactics. Trump treats these outcomes with visible contempt. He mocks retaliation as weakness. He shrugs at farmers as collateral. To him, the gambit still feels clever. But history is unkind to strategies that rely on being feared rather than trusted. The madman gambit delivers fast concessions and lasting enemies. And the longer it runs, the fewer people remain willing to believe the madness is real. By this point, the facts are no longer in dispute. The argument is finished. What remains is the reckoning. What has been established, clearly, repeatedly, and at great cost, is this: Alliances have been converted into transactions. Security, trade access, and diplomatic stability are no longer treated as shared commitments, but as services rendered conditionally, payable, revocable, priced at Washington's discretion. The post-World War II order does not return from this intact. It does not snap back. Systems built on trust do not survive prolonged coercion. And while President Trump frames this rupture as strength, the strategic beneficiary is obvious. China does not need to win a war. It only needs the West to fracture. That fracture is now visible. The consequences are not theoretical. They are already arriving, quietly, unevenly, and directly at the level of ordinary life. Prices rise first. Imported goods cost more. Food prices fluctuate as supply chains reroute under pressure. Electronics, appliances, replacement parts, items people do not buy for pleasure, but because life requires them, become less predictable, not catastrophic, relentless. This is how inflation actually feels. Jobs follow. European industrial capacity shifts location. American manufacturing grows, but slowly and unevenly, constrained by higher input costs and global retaliation. Communities do not collapse overnight. They thin out. Fewer shifts, delayed hiring, projects quietly canceled. Energy volatility adds another layer. Electricity prices swing as infrastructure decisions collide with trade barriers. Battery costs fluctuate. Fuel prices move with geopolitics rather than demand. For households on fixed incomes, especially those over 60, volatility is not an inconvenience. It is a threat. Then comes instability. Political polarization intensifies as economic signals grow contradictory. Legislatures fragment. Compromise becomes rarer. Each shock reinforces the next. I have seen this pattern before, and it never announces itself loudly. It creeps. At moments like this, I pause, even now, and acknowledge the weight of what is unfolding. I have covered crises across decades. I have never seen such deliberate indifference to downstream harm framed as confidence. The contempt is unmistakable. Concerns are mocked. Warnings dismissed as weakness. Consequences treated as someone else's problem. Here is the moral verdict, stripped of emotion. Neutrality no longer exists. Sovereignty has become a callable debt. And the final payer is always the public, without a vote, without a veto, and without a quick exit. This is not ideology, it is accounting, and the invoice is already in the mail. Thank you for staying with me until these final moments. It truly means a great deal. If this story touched you or sparked reflection, please leave a like, hit subscribe, and share so our voices can reach further. Stay strong, stay vigilant, and I will see you in the next journey. Farewell.